closed. Mike's sharp voice barked, "What's the chance, Haney?" Mike's mouth opened and opened again. "Rocket flames," he gasped. "Pushed back. Wind. Splash on hull. May melt. Lighten weight. 100 to 1 against." The odds were worse than that. The ship couldn't land because its momentum was too great for the landing rockets to cancel out. If it had weighed 5 tons instead of 20, landing might have been possible. Haney was saying that if the ship were to be lowered into air while rushing irresistibly sternward despite its rockets, that the rocket flames might be splashed out by the wind. Instead of streaking astern in a lance-like shape, they might be pushed out like a rocket blast when it hits the Earth in a guided missile takeoff. Such a blast spreads out flat in all directions. Here the rocket flames might be spread by wind until they played upon the hull of the ship. If they did, they might melt it as they melted their own steel cases in firing. And 3/4 or more of the hull might be torn loose from the cabin bow section. So much was unlikely, but it was possible. The impossible odds were that the 4 could survive even if the cabin were detached. They were decelerating at 3 gravities now. If part of the ship burned or melted or was torn away, the rocket thrust might speed the cabin up to almost any figure. And there is a limit to the number of gravities a man can take, even in an acceleration chair. Nevertheless, that was what Haney proposed. They were due to be killed anyhow. Joe tried it. He dived into atmosphere. At 60 miles altitude, a thin wailing seemed to develop without reason. At 40 miles, the ship had lost more than 2 miles per second of its speed since the landing rockets were ignited, and there was a shuddering in all its fabric, though because of the loss of speed it was not as bad as the atmosphere graze. At 30, it began to shake and tremble. At 25 miles high, there was as horrible a vibration and as deadly a deceleration as at the air graze. At 12 miles above the surface of the Earth, the hull temperature indicators showed the hind part of the hull at red heat. The ship happened to be traveling backward at several times the speed of sound, and air could not move away from before it. It was compressed to white heat at the entering surface, and the metal plating went to bright red heat at that point. But the hull just aft of the rocket mouths was hotter still. There the splashing rocket flames bathed it in intolerable incandescence. Hull plates, braces, and beams glared white. The tip of the tail caved in. The ship's empty cargo space was instantly filled with an air at intolerable pressure and heat. The hull exploded outward where the rocket flames played. There was a monstrous, incredible jerking of the cabin that remained. That fraction of the ship received the full force of the rocket thrust. They could decelerate it at a rate of 15 gravities or more. They did. Joe lost consciousness as instantly and as peacefully as if he had been hit on the jaw. An unknown but brief time later, he found himself listening with a peculiar astonishment. The rockets had burned out. They had lasted only seconds after the separation of the ship into 2 fragments. Radars on the ground are authority for this. Those few seconds were extremely important. The cabin lost an additional half-mile per second of velocity, which was enough to make the difference between the cabin heating up too and the cabin being not quite destroyed. The cabin remnant was heavy, of course, but it was an irregular object, some 20 feet across. It was below orbital velocity, and wind resistance slowed it. Even so, it traveled 47 miles to the east in falling the last 10 miles to Earth. It hit a hillside and dug itself a 70-foot crater in the ground. But there was nobody in it then. A little over a month before, it had seemed to Joe that ejection seats were the most useless of all possible pieces of equipment to have on a spaceship. He'd been as much mistaken as anybody could be. With an ejection seat, A jet pilot can be shot out of a plane traveling over Mach 1 and live to tell about it. This crumpling cabin fell fast, but Joe stuffed Mike in an ejection seat and shot him out. He and the chief dragged Haney to a seat, and then the chief shoved Joe off, and the four of them, one by one, were flung out into a screaming stream of air. But the ribbon parachutes did not burst. They nearly broke the necks of their passengers, but they let them down almost gently. It was quite preposterous, but all four landed intact. Mike, being the lightest and first to be ejected, came down by himself, in a fury because he'd been treated with special favor. The chief and Joe landed almost together. After a long time, Joe staggered out of his spacesuit and harness and tried to help the chief, and they held each other up as they stumbled off together in search of Haney. When they found him, he was sleeping heavily, exhausted, in a canebrake. He hadn't even bothered to disengage his parachute harness or take off his suit. End of Chapter 5.